Hello, my name is John Brink and we are podcasting on the Brink. And today we in particular podcasting about BC's forest industry in transition. And I'm really pleased to have one of the experts in the field, Jim Girvan, present in our podcast. And Jim is a registered professional forester. He's also an MBA and usually recognized as an expert in this field and a consultant. Extremely interesting background. Jim, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here, John. It's nice to get back to Prince George, where I spent the first half of my career. I haven't been here in quite a long time.
Yeah. So that then being said, Jim, kind of take us back to the beginning. You came originally from Ontario, and you studied there.
Well, it actually started a little before that. When I was, when you grow up in Toronto, everybody wants to go to BC, right? When you go up, let's go on a summer trip to BC. When I was 17 years old, just before I went to university, went out to the coast on the train, went up to the Yukon, went to Alaska, and I remember, coming through here, and after that trip, I made the decision. I'm getting out of the city, and I'm going to study forestry, and I'm going to go out west. That was the plan all along.
That was the trigger.
So I did my 4 years at the University of Toronto, and luckily at the end of in my fourth year, I had a summer job, and I got a phone call from a fellow named George Condor, who was one of the partners at Industrial Forestry Service. He said, "We've got a job here. Why don't you come out?" And we did a little telephone interview for maybe 20 minutes, and he offered me the job, and I said, "A permanent job? I'm in," because in Ontario at the time, they were going through transition, and there wasn't a lot of jobs for graduate
late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, late.
Tough go, right?
It was 79 when I was here, but that last half of the 70s in Ontario, everything was changing there, much as it is here today. Yeah. And so a permanent job out west, that was like, I'm in. Yeah. And I remember in 4 days, I sold my car, quit my summer job, got engaged to my wife, and bought a plane ticket. But before I bought the plane ticket, I had to phone George back. Yeah. Because I wasn't sure if I was going to Prince George or Prince Rupert. I kind of missed that. I was so excited to have a job. George, what town should I buy the plane ticket for?
Yeah, helpful, right?
And 2 days later, I landed. I stayed at the coast into the north in town.
Right behind us.
Right behind us. And the next day, I went to work in the woods.
Now, to make the choice of becoming a registered professional forester, you must like the outdoors, right? Because already that's going to be a big part of the life.
Yeah, you've got to want to understand that if your aspirations in life are to be a forest manager and supervise people or crews, or even you have to understand the trees. You have to go out and, as they say, get your boots wet. Right. And so the job that I took with IFS, as we refer to it now, it was out in the woods. We were locating roads. We were developing the north because it really wasn't that developed at that time.
Now, IFS, Industrial Forest Service, is one of the longest, most well-established forest consulting firms, I would nearly say, in Canada. Yeah. And certainly in Western Canada. Started in the early 50s.
Yeah. Larry DeGrace founded the company, and the objective at the time was to support companies and government to try to get that work done, going out in the woods, locating roads, putting in block boundaries, forest industry. The government tended to do it, but there wasn't enough people in government, and so the consultants became the sector that provided the manpower to get those jobs done.
Yeah, and didn't really understand it, right? because around Prince George in particular, which is so unique, as you know and I know, that in the 50s and in late 40s, late 50s, around Prince George, there were between 600 and 800 sawmills.
Little mills, every road had a mill on it, pretty much.
So the mill would go to the bush. Yeah. Not the bush coming to the mill.
That was a transition that occurred as it became more important to control costs, which has always been an issue. Yeah. The government implemented a policy to force sawmills to start utilizing their waste wood more often by making wood chips, and that required investment, and that required bigger organizations that had deeper pockets. And so the little guys all got swallowed up to become bigger guys.
So that being said, but just kind of staying with the 800 sawmills in the bush, so what they did, they had this single saw and then edger and trim it and then put it on strips and then put it on a truck and then sold it to the planer mills on Planer Road.
Right
behind us.
Right behind us,
Yeah, and all of Planer Road was located right behind us there alongside the CN Railroad.
For the market, right?
Why at the railroad is because they had to load it in a car.
Yeah.
Right, and that's and then as you said, then what happened? The next trigger of transition was close utilization, saying you cannot take a tree, cut it into lumber, and then burn the rest. You must then, or they attracted investments in pulp mills, right? And made concessions.
It's at that time when they were wasting all that wood, really. Yeah. It was probably, what I see in my career at least, is that was the start of an environmental push to get better utilization.
Correct.
Right? You saw this stuff going up in smoke, and at that time it was the government pushing to say, well, let's make wood chips, let's support a pulp industry. Right. So it became an issue of better utilization for the companies. Yeah. Which in the 45 years I've been here has never really stopped. Let's continue to innovate and use more of every tree that we cut.
So that meant that the little sawmill operators, they had to install debarkers, they had to put in chippers, and then they were committed, if they had government timber, to sell the chips to the pulp mills, which then meant that if you had to build debarkers and chippers, that was probably cost 10 times more than the whole mill would cost.
Big investments that they were
so they couldn't do that. And it then created consolidation in the form.
Not a bad thing at the time. No. I mean, there's pros and cons to consolidation, but at that time, the utilization of the resource was necessary because there was so much being wasted. And there's examples of it right up to the current time that's happened. So and that changed, and then the planer mills behind us all of a sudden became sawmills, and on the south side of town you started having sawmills show up that then they brought the wood to town as opposed to bringing the mill to the woods, and that was just a transition around better utilization of the resource.
And then the next thing that happened is that the PGE of the BCR, British Columbia Railroad, came in on the west side of town. Yep. And the BCR industrial side came in, and you then saw the consolidation even going further, and new sawmills were being built there.
Yeah, right? as the little guys collapsed, basically, because of the moves that were being made to, economically put them out of business, and then all their wood just ended up having to come to a central place where they had better sawmills, better lumber recovery sawmills, and the opportunity to chip and produce chips for the pulp mills that eventually got built here in the 60s.
Right. So I came here in 1965. Couldn't speak the language, didn't know soul, didn't have any money. I had $25.47, and I wanted to build a sawmill.
And, this is so you don't forget.
So that's how I got it here. Just for everybody to see, I said $25.47. I counted it 3 times, and I said attitude, passion, work ethic, but follows success. What happened then is that the next transition that took place is that the mill started to consolidate even further in the BCR side, and major operations came in, again acquired cutting rights or access to timber, now called Tenure. Tenure is a renewable, virtually forever forest license.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at British Columbia, it's 95% of it is Crown forest land.
Correct.
So the Crown sets the annual allowable cut to ensure that it's sustainable by looking at the volume that the trees have on the ground today, what their growth rate is, and then the chief forester for the province sets an allowable cut. That cut is then apportioned to various players that can utilize it to, and at the time it was build mills and we'll give you wood so you can create jobs. And it created this flurry of activity that resulted in the BC forest industry by the late 60s, early 70s.
So, and then the other thing that happened is the allocation in regions. So if you look at British Columbia, I don't know exactly how many regions that we have, but you call it timber supply, TSAs. And we hear that for the people, the public that is hearing us and saying that the annual allowable cut is really a formula that calculates that if it takes 100 years to grow a tree, then you can cut one of them a tree, or a proportional to remaining or keeping the volume sustainable at the longer term.
And that was ingrained in law at the time too. You can't have a level of harvest that's going to result in an unsustainable level in the future. And,
Correct.
and you know, the system that was designed at the time, the chief forester for the province got to review those calculations and assumptions every 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
You know, trees grow for 100 years. It's a long time frame. But every 5 to 10 years, let's have a look again. You know, what are we cutting? What is being left behind? Are we utilizing just the big trees, or are we cutting smaller and smaller down? All of those things are factored in, and the cut is adjusted over time.
You see, and I listened to you saying that, is that because when I came here in the mid-60s, lodgepole pine was looked as a weed.
Nobody used it.
Nobody wanted it.
Yeah, that's right.
And nobody wanted it. And it was only then in the late 60s, early 70s that it was classified as opportunity wood.
Opportunity wood.
Because nobody else wanted it, and you could get a forest license. And
if you committed to use it, they would give you a license to cut it.
Correct.
You know, and all of a sudden, more expansion of the mills, more utilization. But again, back to our previous point, better utilization of the forest, because now they used to be cutting the trees that were this big, the spruce and the balsam. Now we're cutting the pine that are this big, which
and it got smaller and smaller and smaller, and an industry that never stopped being in transition really since the early 60s, mid-60s and onward. The other thing that I found interesting about it, because that's where it stimulated me in terms of saying the future is in value added, because I attended, I believe it was the early 70s, the Pearce Commission hearings, a royal commission that once industry, or once, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm right, is that every so often when something of an industry, the size of the forest industry is in transition, if there are different views on it in different areas, then the government or the province may then get a royal commission that take an in-depth look in putting forward a report that gives a general idea of where do we go from here.
Gives the government a path, and typically there's been 2 or 3 of those, I think, over time. The Pearce report, the Sloan Commission was another one, and they were put in place by government because, you know, there was transition, and there was growing differences of opinion on how forests should be used.
Right.
And we'll talk about that more later as more and more people have more and more interest.
Right.
But those commissions, what they ended up doing is saying, here's all the issues, here's the opinions, and here's the direction that will try to, you know, provide employment and economy and sustainability of the resource. Because there's no sense investing in mills and jobs if you don't have a resource that'll support it over time.
And the principle really is, and sometimes my friends, I'm also, as you know, the vice chair of COFI, I'm the only one that's a value-added manufacturer that has no tenure or timber, is that what I usually say is that access to timber, timber first and foremost belong to you and me, the people. Secondly, in British Columbia, and secondly, access to timber is a privilege, and with that goes certain social obligations or prudency, which really means social obligation, and that has been one of the pressing forces usually that are in question about it.
The appurtenancy rules, which basically meant that the individual companies were given the right to harvest trees, and they were to process those trees locally to create employment and grow, you know, rural communities like Prince George, which hugely benefited from it between the late 50s and the 80s. When I showed up, this town quadrupled in size.
Correct.
Because that economy was being built here.
Correct.
Over time, that has changed, again, as politics of the industry, as you know, are always part of it because it's a public resource.
Right.
And as people's attitudes towards it, the forests have changed, and things have constantly evolved. The industry has never stopped changing. People say to me today, well, the industry's in transition. I said, well, it's been in transition since the 70s when I showed up, and in the 60s since you showed up.
Correct.
It's just, that's what this industry has to do because you're utilizing a public resource.
Yeah, and so then the question becomes always that from the mandate for the government, may it be the right side of government, being the Socrats or the BC Liberals now, or the NDP being more towards the left, is always to add more social and economic value to the resource in the regions, preferably, and then go from that point forward.
That's the goal. I mean, as everybody knows, British Columbia economy was built on the forest industry because the forests are everywhere and all of the communities all were able to participate in it now.
Right.
Over time, there's just been more pressure and more people that have become interested in the forest. It's gotten this kind of the transition that we're in today that some people think has just started, but in fact has been going on for years.
Years and years.
Years, yeah.
Now, the other thing that is happening, Jim, is that it was 2 years ago, I believe, that where government, because of all the things that are happening, some of the laws and the rulings of the legal rulings in terms of access to fiber, in particular as it related to First Nations, was determined that they should have more access to timber, and that in fact is happening as we speak. Not only to physically the timber and the rights to the timber, but also sharing in the revenue part of it. And it's a bit of a work in progress. That was one of the pillars, really, although it was legally determined that that be the case, but the intention paper had a number of foundational pieces to it. The one was First Nations, the other one was also making stimulating value-added manufacturing.
The intentions paper, as you say, which was sort of the government signaling to the people and to the industry, this is how we think we want to push the direction of the industry in. The legal decisions around First Nations rights and title was ingrained with the court cases. And then when the current government adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP as they call it, what it said is that we recognize that court decision and we are going to incorporate First Nations interests in everything we do, everything that they do.
Correct.
Specifically in the forest industry, because there's lots of First Nations that live in these communities that we live in. And so as a result, they said, we've got the intention to go down a path that says more First Nations access to timber, more secondary manufacturing in order to create more value and more economy generally in all these communities. A big part of it was getting back what they called social license to get people to more acceptable of the forest industry, because as you know, there's been a lot of media stimulated interest in the industry because of those wanting to stop the logging industry. So there's a balance that has to be found there. And part of that is all about protecting some of the forest for other users. As I said earlier, when we started in this industry in the 60s and 70s, the objective was to maximize the utilization of the wood to create economy. Well, today, a lot of people might suggest some of those trees are better left standing because they create tourism, and they're probably right. Water quality is an issue, with climate change. Climate change itself is a big issue, and forestry can participate in addressing that. So you've got all of these forces that are pulling on the forest that the people own and the government manages. So the intentions paper was, we think this is the path we want to go down, signaling to everybody, that this should address all the various concerns that we've got. And we're just, a year into that process at this point. That's the transition for this year that we're in.
So that then being said, then it becomes an issue that a lot of people are looking at now, is that other things have happened to that process of the annual allowable cut and to make sure that it is sustainable. Then what happened, and it really started in the early 80s when we had the Bowen region, the spruce beetle attack in the areas that you're so familiar with because you worked in those areas.
I grew up in those areas.
Yeah, and so that was in the early 80s, and they used to say you can see it from the satellites in the air. You can see the major clear cut that was done around the
Bowen Lakes. Yeah.
Bowen Lake, and the whole idea was, although the area was this big, they came in from outside to contain it.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, is that a speculation it happened when there were major storms that blew down a lot of trees in the Bowen Lake parks.
Yeah.
And it could not be dealt with legally because it was
because of the park boundary. Yeah.
And it kind of started from there.
And the bugs basically blew north into the Bowen Valley and killed everything, right?
Yeah.
It was looking back, and hindsight's always 20/20. We learn a lot by looking back. At the time, it was probably one of the very first indications that the climate was changing.
Yeah.
From the forest industry perspective.
Yeah.
Because the reason that the beetles took off is because they had this big windstorm, the incident that created the food for the beetles.
Yeah.
But then we didn't get the cold weather in order to stop it.
Yeah.
We used to get, frequently really, really cold winters up here, and it would kill those beetles, and they wouldn't proliferate.
And you needed about 30 below for about 2 weeks or so, because the beetles, what happens with it goes to the bottom of the tree, and if it gets cold enough, then it kills them off.
Yeah, and that didn't, in that particular year, it didn't happen. And they took off, and once they're flying, they just kept going and killed everything.
Unbelievable.
So it became this big salvage effort, because when you kill spruce trees, with beetles, they don't last very long before they get rotten and fall over.
And that makes it kind of unique on a spruce tree versus a lodgepole pine.
Which came later.
Yeah, which came later, because the spruce tree will go down quicker than the lodgepole pine. So it's sustainability of it and the longer term economic viability.
So they had to log it very, very quickly in order. So they took all of the logging operations from all of the companies all around the region. They pulled out of Fort St. James, they pulled out of Vanderhoof, and they all came to the Bowen Valley and logged. Yeah. And successfully, I think, contained, got the value out of the wood that was otherwise dead and would have burned.
And one of the last ones that was in there was me. I built a sawmill right in the middle of it in 1983 till 1987.
You took the mill back to the woods, so to speak.
I did, because that was the only viable way of doing it at the time. So interesting enough, that's 40 years ago, Jim. Yeah. If I go back, and I was there I go there 2-3 times a year, because I just, driving through there, I cannot believe what has happened to the Bowen.
It's a beautiful forest now, isn't it?
Unbelievable. But it also paints a picture for us in terms of what we are saying with the annual allowable cut going from an average of around 60 million cubic meters annually, where it used to be, then the uplift dealing with pine beetle up to as high as 80, and then going back to the 60, and then 35 mills shut down, and now we are at 40, 35, 40, or whatever we are. And now we're dealing, and we'll talk about that more, but I just want to put that in there. Now we're dealing with what they call the midterm, meaning that during that period, we will be dealing with not enough fiber, too much capacity, and supply of fiber, and the amount of conversion plants or sawmills has to be reduced to 35, 40 in the midterm. But what shows me the midterm, go to the Bowen. And all of a sudden you see that the midterm probably means 40, 50, 60 years. And depending on how well we manage the forest, we can accelerate that if we, invest enough, and not all that much even, into the forest.
Yeah, and you can see we had the beetles kill all the spruce, and then almost on the heels of that, the pine, as you said, the pine beetles sort of came. The difference being there is that with the pine beetles, they only attack the pine trees. but we had successive years where there was not cold enough weather, and they spread farther and faster. And I think the estimate is that they killed more than 60% of all pine in the British Columbia interior.
Correct.
That's a lot of wood.
That's a lot of wood.
That's the classic. Everybody's seen the pictures of the red forests with the little green, spruce on the edges.
Yeah.
Again, a very big salvage effort. The government raised the allowable cut, from about 60 to 80, really just saying to the companies, let's salvage this wood. Let's, again, make use of the wood, get the value out of it before it either falls over or burns, right? And in the last few years, we've seen a lot of it burn. So the cut went up, and now the cut's coming down, and eventually you're going to come back into balance. But the downside to what happened with the pine beetles is we logged a lot of that wood that we should have spread out over time into the midterm.
Correct.
But we logged it in a very short period.
Right.
And then we ended up with this dilemma that as the chief forester makes sure that the rate of harvest is sustainable, they brought the cut down year by year as it was salvaged to make sure it was sustainable. And now you've got an imbalance between the capacity of mills to utilize the wood and the wood that's available to be harvested with the tenures.
Yeah.
And that's when we saw mills starting to close by 2004 and 5. And that's, in my career, I got pretty good at forecasting how that would happen. It wasn't, in my mind, it wasn't really rocket science.
No.
You've got so many logs coming from the forest, and you got so many mills that have capacity to utilize logs.
Yeah.
They have to be in balance.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
As soon as if there's more wood than there is capacity, like we saw in the 60s, more mills got built.
Yeah.
Or new lines got put into mills, right? Or they got more efficient so they could get more wood through them. In the 2000s and up in the last 5 or 10 years, it's gone the other way, where the logs coming out of the forest are reduced in order to ensure it's sustainable, and now you've got the mills that had to close. I think to date, since 2004, if I recall, was the first one that went down. We've had 35 mills in rural communities that employ people have gone away. Yeah. And we're getting close to that balance again, given the level of the cut today.
Maybe 3-4 more or something in there.
I think that the last forecast I did, that by the midterm there would be 3-4 more. But in fact, we've seen in the last months, we've seen major closures on the coast and in the interior that are inching towards that forecast.
Yeah, the other thing I find interesting about you is, as an expert in the field and being a consultant, still very active today. Government relies on your consultation together with others. Is that the times we met, you and me met once before, way back in the early 80s, you reminded me of at IFS, when I was engaged with IFS in one of the challenges that I was dealing with.
It was a challenge, to say the least, where the whole issue of how they graded lumber was an issue, and as I understand the story, as Harry Gairns explained it to me, there was 2 sets of rules, one set for you and one set for them. One set for you, as in you, the buyer of lumber, versus them, the producers of lumber, and at the end of the day, it wasn't right.
You see,
and you fixed it.
Yeah, it cost me everything. It cost me my company. Yeah. I always remind me of it's like walking across the street on green, and on the pathway you should walk, and you get run over by a truck, but it was not your fault. But now you're dead. So that particular case in particular was about that purely circumstantial. Where on August the 10th, 1986. I found from, I was the deputy chair of one of the COFI organizations, the Quality Control Committee, and I was complaining about the quality variances that affected my company.
It didn't look right.
Didn't look right, and I was an expert in the field, and I kept pressing them, and I always remember this one person. It's all in my book, and it's all in the lawsuit that followed. Is that the fella told me that there were I can still feel it today. It was 10 o'clock or in the morning, and I was standing there, and he said there are, in effect, 2 sets of grading rules.
I bet that's what you did.
Unbelievable. The one is the public one, on which architects, builders of houses, and all the people that buy structures rely on, carefully written. And the other one was far less restrictive, and was one used by not all of the industry, substantial portion of the industry.
To push their bottom lines.
Yeah. And it became a multi-billion-dollar fraud, because after 10 years or so, it took me, and it cost me everything that I had. It was in existence, unbelievable, from Florida to California, from Labrador to Alaska. And it changed everything, and it changed the rules.
And the funny thing I recall about that is that, with what they were doing, here was the public guidelines, but they were pushing lower grades of lumber into those public guidelines.
Into the higher
putting all construction at risk. I mean, that's really what was happening.
Yeah.
Which in the big scheme of things, you go, well, how can you let that keep going, right? But it did, and once the light was put on it, it was stopped, right? And unfortunately, you did not fare well in that discussion.
What happened, Jim, a lot of people knew, and this was where I thought it was local, then I thought it was regional, then I thought it was BC, then Canada. Yeah. It existed from Florida to California, Labrador to Alaska.
Everybody was...
Everybody, and the people that knew about it didn't, in a lot of cases, think that was right, but in the industry it worked this way. You did not want to raise questions about it. If you did, you never work again in the industry. And that's the way it was.
That's why, of late, not in this case, but in a lot of other industries where issues come up, they've got whistleblower protection. That's really what you were at the time. Right. And as everybody knows, whistleblowers get punished, right? And you can't do that anymore, right?
No.
So it's unfortunate, but they've changed it, for the better, I think now, and you've recovered, obviously, and
I look in
some more hard work.
Well, as far as I was concerned, I could not stand in the front of the mirror, and if I had to do something about it, but I had no idea the magnitude that it was. Anyway, so that's kind of, so that's where we met first, and then we met again because we were both involved in the case indirectly. You as an expert in the field, and me, as one of the litigants, in regards to availability of fiber, and you already then were recognized as a expert, and I knew about you, and I knew about what you had done in that field, and and had a lot of respect for you and your area, and
Well, what I had for 17 years, I had a business partner, Murray Hall, and what we did is we sat down and we said, I think that there's a need in this industry for a picture, to be able to demonstrate and show people that this concept I spoke of earlier, supply and demand are always in balance.
Correct.
Doesn't matter what industry you're in, supply and demand have to balance.
Correct.
So we sat down and we went through all of the annual allowable cut calculations and the different tenures and timber supply areas and tree farm license, put it all in this column, and then we took all the sawmills and all the pulp mills and and as they evolved, power boilers and then pellet plants, and we put them over in this column. And this was in a very complicated, Excel spreadsheet.
Right.
And at the end, we pushed the button and said, well, how close are we?
Yeah.
And at the time, we were pretty close.
Yeah.
But then we said, okay, now let's look forward 5 years and 10 years and 15 years.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the balance was going like this, where the wood supply was going down.
Right.
And we showed that picture to the world.
Yeah.
And they went, I'm not sure about that.
No.
And we said, well, we're so sure that we're going to make a prediction here. And in 2010, we made a prediction in a report that was published by Russ Taylor and Associates.
Correct.
That within 7 years, 16 sawmills would close.
Yeah.
As they were forced back into balance.
Correct.
And it was national headlines.
Yeah.
And 7 years later, 16 sawmills were closed.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that is carefully sitting back and with knowledge and the right expertise with including Russ Taylor, who also is an expert I hope to have on the show here in the next month or two. But again, calculating as where do we go and how do we get there, and what happens when we do is very much the issue today in terms of, again, looking around the region with the new reality. Hence, the discussions that are now going on between value-added manufacturers in the primaries and government on the basis of the intentions paper.
Yeah, the intentions papers, as I said, is lined out. This is the path they want to go down to. They all, as in I think the industry, maybe not the environmental community, but government certainly recognizes supply's gone down, right? Because we've had 2 years of major fires and many years of what we call normal fire behavior. We've had spruce beetles, we've had pine beetles. The spruce beetles back north of town and around Mackenzie, we've got spruce beetles again.
Correct.
The supply of logs is going down. Mills have closed, employment's gone down. One of the key legs to the intentions paper is, can we create employment back in these communities by promoting secondary manufacturing?
Correct.
And as you know, absolutely you can.
Absolutely.
You can make logs into 2x4 and 2x6, and it's a good business. It's a profitable business.
Correct.
There's lots of demand for that wood,
Correct.
albeit it goes up and down, but it's fairly steady.
Correct.
But can you employ more people in rural communities where mills otherwise would have closed by making secondary products? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
So how do we get there? And I think my interpretation of where we're at today in that intentions paper is that the people that have the wood and the people that need the wood to create those secondary jobs, they don't quite understand each other. And I don't think they know what government's real intentions are. The intention is to create jobs, but how do you get there? That's the hard part. And I think if the government would, and I hope they don't take this the wrong way, go a little faster here, we might all understand and get there a little quicker, right? But I think the goal is right.
You see, when the announcement was made in regards to the intentions paper, that there were 3 different stakeholder groups that were represented. The one was First Nations, the other one was labor and industry, and somehow I was, not by design, but I thought I would be one of the people in the industry, especially the one that, has a very strong background and is an advocate of further manufacturing, of value-added manufacturing. But I was the one. And what I said is that, and I still believe that today, that the industry obviously is in transition. And I believe what will happen to the primary sector, that once, obviously what has happened is that a lot of people in the primary sector is 2 issues really, that a lot of the annual albicott, what is left over now, approximately 70% or somewhere around there, is controlled by a half a dozen companies who have decided that they don't really want to invest at this point in BC because they cannot be competitive on a global market and have decided to invest elsewhere. At some point, that issue has to be addressed, and when it is, then once they start investing again, the mills will become smaller. They will be more focused on the profile of timber available to those mills. They will include a lot more technology, robotics and other technology, where there will be a lot less people involved in the primary manufacturing sector. I believe also that there is huge potential for value-added manufacturing who work together with the primary sector. So you have innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. And intensive secondary, in my opinion, looks like primaries that engage directly in further manufacturing or value-added manufacturing in combination with doing what they are now doing, or in strategic relationships between primaries and secondaries or individual secondary manufacturers.
I think the strategic relationships is the way to go. They're different businesses. What you do is different than what Canfor or West Fraser or any of those major sawmills. They run sawmills and they're good at it.
But not good at the other.
Yeah, but they're not good at the other, right? So why would they dabble there with other people? Right?
And it then becomes a Me Too project, which usually doesn't last, right? Yeah. And hence we have seen that in the past, So what I'm saying now is that that's where we are today, is that so government saying we want more value-added manufacturing, and the submissions that I've made to them is basically saying, and to the primary sector for that matter, and I've been quite vocal about it, is that if we want to stimulate investment in secondary or value-added manufacturing of lumber in particular, then there has to be a reasonable expectation of access to fiber.
Yeah.
If you don't have reasonable expectation of access to fiber, you will not get anybody to invest in that sector.
Yeah. Or you might get the people that want to invest.
Yeah.
But you're not going to get the money for it.
No.
I mean,
not in a meaningful way.
I spent 2 years of my career working at one of the big 5 banks as a commercial lender to the forest industry.
Correct.
And I saw firsthand from being having those banker types behind you, when they're looking at your balance sheet and your business plan, raw material is probably number one, right beside, well, how much money do you already have? They always want to know that.
Correct.
And if you don't have that reasonable expectation of some kind of supply, and you don't have to own it, or you don't have to have it in tenure,
reasonable expectation.
You have to have it. Then there's likely an opportunity that they would look more favorably at financing, right? I know, you've financed lots of things in your career. That people don't want to lend money unless they're going to get it back, and there's a good chance you won't get it back if you can't guarantee, or at least have reasonable expectation, that you've got raw material with which to make this widget, this finger jointed, this door molding, this window frame, whatever that value-added piece looks like. You've got to have that wood supply.
Yeah.
And that's we talked earlier about that balance between all these people pulling on what do we do with the forest. I think the challenge for the industries, the value added and the primaries and government, is there also has to be that balance with how do you make that relationship happen? Because as you know, we saw 2x4s at $1,800 a thousand just in the last 18 months. Everybody should be in that business because it makes tons of money, right? What we're now talking about is taking some of those 2x4s out of that market in order to create high value-added products and create more employment. So what happens in a big scale if that were to progress to the point where there was a major secondary manufacturing? The value of those 2x4s is going to come up, and there's going to be even more pushback to sell you lumber. So you have to find that balance somehow. But it's a public resource. We have to remember that. We have to remember that. It's a public resource. So what's good for the public? And that's the challenge every government faces. And how do we push and pull and steer and allocate so that we meet those mutual objectives without putting them on either side of the fence, so to speak? Because if lumber was at $2,000 a board foot, I don't know if the secondary manufacturers could afford it, but they certainly wouldn't even want to think about it because that's a good market.
You see, the thing now is, Jim, is that if we agree as a province and politically that once the mills, especially the ones that are publicly owned, are not investing right now in BC because they are not, in their minds, globally competitive. This is a choice they have to make. And if a CEO did it anyway, he wouldn't last very long. So that then being said, that's the reality. But on the other hand, at some point they will invest again, and then it will look then different in terms of sawmills will even employ less people.
I think that's true.
But I'm saying also is that And as you know, I'm not shy about being public about it. I was the founding president of the BC Council Value Added Wood Processors in the mid 90s for about 10 years. That represented 8 associations, 800 companies.
Yeah.
Of those, less than 1/3 are left.
Because of the fiber issue, primarily.
Because of what?
The fiber issue.
They
couldn't get supply.
What did it, in my opinion, is this. A couple of things in the early 2000s with the BC Liberal government and with Gordon Campbell as premier, then the industry, meaning the primary sector, was able to get a number of changes being made. The one was the small business program, became BCTS, BC Timber Supply, and mainly available to anybody that would want to bid on it.
It's a public auction system.
Yeah, by public auction. The other one was the notion of pertinency had disappeared in terms of the right log to whatever mill, wherever that may be. And then the other one meant, and that was a huge one, is that the government had started putting money into industry to find markets for their lumber in other places than the traditional ones, and started opening the markets in China in particular.
Making sure that there was places to sell the lumber. That was the primary industry at the time.
The problem with that issue were that the Chinese, with all due respect to our friends in China, are mainly bottom feeders. The volume of lumber going to China were all low grades. They're not building houses like we do. It's not dimension. It's all low grades. So between the changes to the small business program, no more fiber for the secondary manufacturers that they could use as leveraging for other raw material. And the program was flawed, you know that, I know, but the concept was not. And because the currency in the industry, even today, is timber.
And it's interesting, you talk about, the China buying, the big volumes of low-grade lumber. It's the same thing your company does, is gets those same volumes and makes those products. It's like all those secondary manufacturing jobs are really in China, right? And during the pine beetle epidemic, there was a lot of that wood. The volume available went up, and then as the salvage efforts ended, it came back down. And there was that period in between where there was major volumes going to China. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Because we're not generating that same volume. And that's what's created this difference of view on where we're really going, as outlined in the intentions paper.
You see, the troubling part about this, Jim, is, and I'm very close to that because I live it every day, and then also in our discussions with the value-added manufacturing sector and government, and Kofi in particular representing the primary manufacturers, is that even the volume of lumber that goes to China, the secondary manufacturers here in BC would pay as much, if not more, for that lumber. But the interesting part about it is that with one phone call to China, you can sell 3 months worth of production.
And it's easy to do.
And that has become the problem.
Put it on the rail car,
gone. Or put it in a box in a container, send it to China. And the effect on it has been dramatic. The other one that is an amazing thing, I've been quite involved representing secondary manufacturers in terms of the softwood lumber negotiations. I was involved in Lumber 1, Lumber 2, Lumber 3 on behalf of secondary manufacturers. We were able to negotiate with the BC government, the federal government, and the Americans, that the secondary manufacturers that had no tenure would pay duties, but our argument was they should pay no duties, since the allegations are that we are being subsidized.
The primaries are being subsidized.
Yeah. And I always say the Americans making the right argument for the wrong reason. That's my opinion. And so in any event, we were able then to negotiate a deal that the secondary manufacturer would pay duties on the value of the inputs, not on the more value they add, the more they have to pay.
Yeah. And so the penalty is exponentially reduced based on the value of the product you're going to make.
Correct.
Yeah.
What happened in lumber 4, or now even still, is that part in the last go around in negotiations was by accident or on purpose was not included.
Yeah.
And so that then meant that secondary manufacturers had to pay up to whatever the highest rate was, 20% duties.
Yeah, and I think that, again, not being involved with the process, but any kind of allowance that was being made for those kinds of products was just contrary to the Americans' bigger goal.
Yeah.
Stop our industry in favor of their industry. And you've got to recognize that it's not about right or wrong. They just want to stop us from operating and selling wood into their market so that they can produce it themselves.
And that they can push up.
They can put their own prices up and create their own employment. I mean,
and so what I'm saying is a lot of times about in regards to the softwood lumber deal, it's nothing to do with any other issues as that they can find 20 different issues as to why we should slow down the amount of volume. One of the troubling part about it is, though, that so many of the major tenure holders now in the province of British Columbia have more of their operations in the States than they have in Canada.
They just recognized that the fiber supply was going away. They're the ones that shut the majority of the 35 mills, and in the U.S. South, where they've all invested, there's just lots of wood, right?
Yeah.
And even though they built lots and lots of new capacity there in the last 10 years, there's still more wood than that. So
exactly.
Again, we're always trying to find a balance, right? Whether it's the forest, whether it's who gets to use the wood, who gets to use the tenure. What they saw in the U.S. South was an imbalance where there was, and it's a unique scenario where there was a lot more supply of logs than there was capacity. So what do? You go and put some capacity in and take advantage of those logs, because when there's a big supply, the price goes down. But in doing that, what they've done is they've shut down all of the lower efficiency mills in British Columbia, right? You look around town here, there's been 4 or 5 sawmills, within 100 kilometers of a shutdown. They were all the ones that weren't quite as good at utilization of the wood. The ones that are left are very, very good. They're world-class mills.
Right.
And one of the fundamental reasons we can't compete is because the log costs have gone up for them, in part due to the falling supply, and you have to go farther and costs are more to haul it. And then the stumpage system that the province has is out of whack with what the market really looks like, and we've become the worst in the world in producing lumber.
And so what I say is that I believe, and then kind of talking about BCTS, BC timber supply area, that in the early 90s, mid 90s, the government then made a decision on the pressure of value-added manufacturers, and I was part of them, obviously as the president of BC Council of Value-Added Wood Processors, to recognize that the timber is the currency that stimulates value-added manufacturing. That timber is used as leverage to access lumber in most cases, and will end up again at the primary.
As long as the program isn't taken advantage of, and that's a hard thing to figure out, as we both know, but it's not like you're proposing to take logs away from the majors.
No.
All you're saying is give them to me so I can negotiate.
Correct.
And I'll create jobs.
Correct.
And I'll create high value products.
Correct.
And maybe they won't fall under the duty. And these are all win-wins.
And that's the frustrating part from my perspective. I say to the primaries, because I'm the strongest voice, because there's not much left of the value-added manufacturing sector. Like I was also the president of the Northern Interior value-added manufacturing sector here in this region, and we had close to between 40 and 50 companies that were value-added manufacturers. Now you have less than 3 or 4, and all of them are questionable as will they be around.
Yeah, and that becomes the challenge that, as I said earlier in the intentions paper, the intention of the government's good. It's those details that are hard to work out between the parties so that we can stimulate those business-to-business relationships that say logs go to the sawmills, lumber gets sold on the market and to secondary manufacturers, and let's find that balance and create economy, because the forest industry today is not in good shape.
No.
Costs have gone up.
Yeah.
The value of the lumber has gone down. Just the whole break-even dollar value has gone, I think back in the, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, $200, $250, $1,000, was kind of break even. We're up around 500 now because of these cost issues.
Exactly.
And so how do we make us more prosperous, right?
So I say that the stumpage system is broken. It should be fixed.
The lag that it has is just unworkable.
Is not workable. It should be changed. That's my view, has been my view on it. The other part that I say is that including to the primaries, because I said it's in your interest because the timber belongs to you and me, the people, and if the industry goes to the point where the investments happen again, will employ even less people, there will be more and more pressure on saying, is the tenure system correct for this province as it exists today? And the answer likely is no, it isn't. So, and to preserve themselves and preserve their investments, what I'm saying is this, is that I believe that as the industry reinvests again in particular, and then recognizes the benefits of value-added manufacturers, either by themselves, by strategic relationships, or independence, is that I see it that 100% of the lumber that will be manufactured, that I believe 25% or up to 50% will go up the value chain. That means 25% of the lower quality and 25% of the higher value lumber will go up the value chain.
Depending on the product that people plan to make. Yep.
Yeah, but that's where the opportunities lie. If that were the case, I can think of in at least my opinion, if we had the 25% that we send to China, which is all low-grade manufacturing, I have the data on it, is that that if we were able to further manufacture that here and pay as much for it as the Chinese would, that virtually instantly means in the next couple of years would create 10 to 20,000 jobs in that direct jobs in that sector alone.
Yeah, and in communities that have lost mills, that's required, right? Unfortunately, we're also going to bump up to the reality that everybody's looking for employees, but if you've got a good job that pays well, you tend to find the employees, is my experience.
Yeah, no question about it. I agree with that.
The government, as I say, the intentions are the intentions are what they are. They're good intentions.
Yeah.
The politics of the industry and the complication, it's such a complicated business with the Forest Act and the regulations that steer it, and the ownership control there's the First Nation. How do we get the tenure into the hands of First Nations and incorporate their understanding of the forest into the management? All of those things, they're trying to change at once, and it'll be difficult. So I think
I agree with
we're both optimistic, I think, that we'll get there because the intentions are good, but it's not going to happen overnight because it is so complicated.
I want to run this one by you that, correct me if I'm wrong, is saying that this First Nations by law and for all the reasons that we talked about earlier will own more and more of the timber, maybe even up to 20% of the annual allowable cut.
Easily. I mean, we're encroaching on that today.
Yeah. So that's reality. The other part that I believe is that the value-added sector, including myself, leading the way really in terms of softwood lumber allocations of timber in the early 90s and late 90s. Flaws in the program, no question. Conceptually, I still agree to that today, that now as BCTS was meant to be 20% of the annual allowable cut be designated to value-added manufacturing. That means 40% of the tenure is in hands other than the primary tenure holders. That being then said, it creates a much stronger argument to the Americans in terms of that we have an open market, because that's the main argument that is the U.S. is using for justifying duties.
That I may disagree with you on that, because I think the American argument is they want to stop our industry. It doesn't matter what it looks like.
No.
Because I agree with you. I mean, even today we've got a stumpage system that's driven by an open market auction for wood. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So what else? It's like, what else can we do, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe what we can do is diversify it more. Will that help? I'm not sure. But I don't disagree with you that having a more diversified holdings of the tenure would be good in order to promote a diversified use of the tenure.
Yeah.
That's where we're trying to get to.
And so what industry now, for reasons that I cannot understand, either they, respectfully to my friends in the primary sector, not understand, because I say, look at it from a reasonable perspective. The value added, if you want a successful value added manufacturing, you have to have a healthy primary. Together, us talking to government would be much more effective than what it's unstoppable, because if we don't succeed now, the pressure will be there to go in that direction.
I just think it's that fear of they're not sure where it's going. And when you have $1,800 a thousand for lumber, that's a pretty good business, John. And let's make more. Let's make more of that.
Is and let's make sure. I think what is the question now is that's why industry is pushing the tenure holders or the privileged ones are pushing so hard back to making sure that timber doesn't get in the hands of value-added manufacturers. You know, is that?
But they're going to get it. They're going to get it back, right? That's
what
your
I'm
point.
saying to them, and they said no.
They're not sure of that, right?
No,
and I think it's a hangover from the systems that they tried, 10, 20 years ago that failed, where that actually didn't happen.
Yeah.
And there's just fear of the unknown.
Yeah. And I agree with that.
Can be a stumbling block.
I agree with you 100%. Because what I'm saying is that and I say that too, even in the negotiation with the primaries are sitting there, secondaries are sitting there, I say, explain to me your concern about it, because I don't know any secondary manufacturer that is planning to build a sawmill.
Yeah.
So the wood will come back to you. So what are you talking about? You're taking my wood, and I say, okay, stop for a second. It's not wood. Your wood. It's
our wood.
Let's start with that. And then the other one is that it goes back to you. So, and if you don't give me a coherent answer, then I think the answer is, I don't control it then. And if that's the answer, that's not a good one. Yeah.
Well, let's hope government keeps listening to all of us, right? Because like as I say, the intention's good. It's these details that are going to be difficult. And history will tell you governments successfully have not always gotten it right.
Right.
And that's why, the previous, programs that they had to get hands into the wood of secondary manufacturers. I know some of them right in town here did build a mill, cut that lumber, sold it.
Yeah.
And they don't exist today, right?
Yeah.
Because they were taking advantage of the system.
Exactly.
Right? So if we can fix that, I think we'll move the government down the path of achieving what their intentions are.
So one of the conversations has been, particularly shocking in a way, and everybody gets in a panic about it, is the old growth deferrals. So now, a lot of people think about old growth, these trees that are 10 feet across and these beautiful, beautiful trees, and that's what it is. But that's not only what it is. It goes much further than that, and you were very involved in writing the report together with Rob Schutz was involved and IFS. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the old growth, again, this is one of the planks, I guess you'd call it, of the intentions paper, where the government, again, they're trying to balance the various people pulling on the forest, and the environmental community has been particularly loud in that there's only 3% left. That was what sort of created a crisis, so to speak. A report by some biologists that interpreted the forest inventory data incorrectly, as subsequently been shown, that suggested there's only 3% old growth left in the province, right? And the public gravitated to that issue. I think public polling generally suggests that people, maybe not outright support, but they're not against the forest industry. We've done some recent polling to say most people understand. Sure, there's a vocal crowd. It's probably 1 in 5 is what the recent polling showed. But the public gravitated to this notion, well, wait a minute, we thought the forests were being managed sustainably. If there's only 3% left, that doesn't add up. No. And at face value, I don't disagree.
Yeah.
But the reality is that there's 55 million hectares of forest that we use to log and create forest products in the entire province. And about 11 million of that is considered old trees. Now, I say old trees versus old growth because old growth is an environmentalist term meant to incite action from the public. There's only 3% old growth left, right? So, old trees on the coast are big, as you say. Old trees over there are like this, right? Yeah. They're small, right? And it really depends on the ecosystem and the place in the province that you're at. You can have old forests that don't have big trees.
Right.
These are details, though. The public doesn't understand that. No. They gravitated towards, there's a crisis in the forest, we have to do something about it. And then the media obviously has been, we've all seen it, the blockades on the highways in Vancouver and gluing hands to various things. Fairy Creek, the last unprotected watershed, even though it was
Teal Jones
had the battle of their lifetimes on their hands. So the government and the intentions paper said we're going to move down this path. Which they did. So they hired a committee of environmentalists.
Not good.
Not good. It was
not balanced.
It was extremely disappointing for members that were all associated with one or the other environmental organizations, and a First Nations forester. There was 5 of them on the panel. And so what they were tasked to do was identify the most at-risk forest in the province, and we'll just defer it. Now, defer means we won't log it immediately. Delay, put it on hold while we work through the intentions paper and come up with a new way to consider old forests as part of the broader ecosystem.
In a responsible way, right?
Good intention, right? We have to make this change, so let's just make sure that there's some that's still there just in case we log it all, which was really ridiculous. We got 11 million hectares of it, 75% of which is protected. Totally protected. We'll never ever touch it. That
mainly down the coast?
Across the province. There's 11 million hectares of old growth timber in the province. 75% will never ever be considered loggable. That never hits the media, ever. I've never seen that fact in the media.
Now it will.
So anyway, so then you defer hectares. Well, the 2.6 million hectares that were identified, about half of it was coincident with that timber harvest land base, the land that we
3 million.
3 million, and at the end of the day, it's about 7%. Well, remember we've talked about supply and demand. You take 7% of the supply out, 7% of the capacity will follow. And
it has to.
It has to, right? You just, and so anyway, we did the analysis and we predicted that you're probably going to lose, 4 or 5 sawmills on the coast and 4 or 5 in the interior. Not all big mills. There's going to be some small ones because there's a lot of mills, smaller mills that rely on those old big logs to make, even value-added products.
I'm thinking Kootenays, Okanagan region.
Coast quite a bit,
Coast a lot.
Lots of companies still they use those primary timbers to make value-added products. And so they went down the path and the government said, we're going to defer this stuff, but consistent with UNDRIP, we want First Nations support, right? And so but unfortunately, they only gave them 30 days and we're a year into it and we haven't heard back from them all. So what happens, as I say, the intention might be good to have a pause while we move to a new forest regime. It's just caused so much chaos in the industry.
Well, no, it's just hanging there.
It's hanging there. We're not sure what's going to happen.
And from a company perspective, if you don't know, you plan for the worst and you hope for the best.
It's no different than the scenario we've talked about where we don't know where they're going to end up with secondary manufacturing and fiber allocation. So what happens is you kind of stop a little bit, right? And so we're in a situation in the province now where we've got weak markets. A lack of wood because BC Timber Sales, who manages the public auction system for the province's timber, they immediately stopped logging any old growth, and so there's no timber sales. I was with a colleague yesterday, he says there hasn't been a timber sale offered for sale in this region in a year. So the
And
wood
that
supply
is
is going away
from the volume of BCTS.
from the volume that they're supposed to harvest, because they were mandated not to log in old growth, and all the timber they had to sell was in old growth.
And the annual volume of BCTS is around 11 million cubic meters, and now about half that.
15 to 20%, and they took 750,000 hectares and said, no, you can't log there. So there's no sale. So people are wondering, well, why are the sawmills on 2 and 3 and 4 day shifts here? Well, there's no wood. You know, you look over at the pulp mill just across the river here. You know, there used to be a big chip pile there that they utilized, right? Not now. It's just, you know, a couple of days where they're on the edge of closing on any given day. And it's all because of this, the slow pace with which the intentions paper is moving, the old growth's moving, the secondary manufacturing issues are moving, and everybody's kind of, you know, we don't know what's going to happen, so they've all slowed down.
Now, just coming back to the intentions paper and the acreage of
2.6 million hectares.
So, and that is across the province. You know, so it's hanging there because of they gave First Nations 30 days to respond. That's more than a year ago now.
Whether they support or didn't support.
Yeah. And is it hanging partially because of that?
I think it's part of it, right? The government did report that a lot of First Nations had provided their perspectives on it. But until, you know, I think the government's just hesitant to move until they've got First Nation support. All these old growth hectares are in somebody's traditional territory.
Yeah.
So it's put it into limbo. And there's one thing that an industry, you know, like ours doesn't like is uncertainty. So we have uncertainty. Is there going to be wood or not?
Yeah.
So what do? You stop. You stop investing.
Plan for the worst. Right?
Logging contractors. Oh, I'm not sure if I'll be working. They stop investing.
Yeah.
The logging contractor that you know, made up some of his work in timber sales. Well, there aren't any sales. So
now again, to put it into perspective, because I believe that is so critically important, is that what we already say is that 75% of the 11 million cubic meters,
11 million hectares
that is considered to be old growth is already protected.
75%. Never, it's in a park or it's in a reserve, and it'll never ever be a cancer, or it's uneconomic, and it'll never be considered for logging.
And then other areas like Teal Jones and their logging that had got so much publicity, where we see pictures of stumps of, you know, these amazing trees that are, you know, that create the impression by the public. That's what all it is.
It's an impression.
But it's the wrong impression.
It's a story that was manufactured by the environmentalists who have, in my opinion, now clear it's my opinion, that their goal is to stop logging in British Columbia. That's the goal.
Yeah.
It's not about protecting forests, it's about stopping logging. And so they create this impression.
And they're raising a lot of money doing it, right?
Absolutely. I mean, just look at, they had GoFundMe pages for Fairy Creek, the people that showed up. People gravitated to an issue that they thought was a crisis.
Yeah.
There was no crisis. There never has been.
Now, in all fairness, you know, I come from the area that I don't believe, and I've been always vocal about that because that's what I believe, that we should not be exporting logs, period. You know, now there may be some exception, but we should not do that. And then the other one, we should preserve, or we should as a province look at, you know, some of the forest where we see these amazing trees, and, you know, that the government's responsibility is to look at that from a perspective of what gives the highest return to the province in terms of, from an economic perspective. Is it from a tourist perspective more attractive, or should we knock them down and then turn it into lumber? And that decision has to be made very, very carefully.
That's the balance. That's the balance.
That's the balance.
And I don't think it has to be one or.
And
I believe it has to be some of each.
Yeah, and I agree with that.
Because you can't go and look at an old growth tree unless you have a logging road to drive in to look at it.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other part about it, Jim, is that a lot of people don't understand, and you know, that I talk to about the old growth, is that if you look in the interior in particular, the other thing that I say, correct me if I'm wrong, is I always have had the position that although we have a forest industry in British Columbia, the coast is distinctly different from the interior.
Absolutely. It's a different set of circumstances.
One
it's
set of
different
rules
markets.
cannot apply to both.
It's different products, it's different markets, it's different tree species. You have to look at them different. You're right. But what the government did with the technical advisory panel, the environmental group that came up with they had a broad-brushed approach. They protected some of every ecosystem in the province, no matter where it was. So you've got these scattered snippets of timber that they've identified that are just sitting in limbo now, waiting for First Nations support. But it's just really not consistent with what good forest management, which is good for climate change.
Now, the report that you guys prepared, what did that say? Or what did that was for the government?
Yeah,
right?
actually it was for Kofi, is what we did it for. And
Yeah.
they wanted to understand on behalf of their members. And
Yeah.
really in a nutshell, as I said, if you take the deferrals and assume they become permanent,
Yeah.
because in my career, I've never seen a deferral come back into the working forest land
Yeah,
base.
no.
These are de facto gone as part of the path we're going down to manage our forests somewhat differently. So we take 7% of this supply out, we're going to lose 7% of the capacity. And we told them that's 4 or 5 mills on the coast and in the interior of in different places. We've already been stressed in the north here with the pine beetle, and a lot of that wood
In fires.
and the fires, and so we've lost a lot of wood that was supposed to be that sustainable level of harvest at 60 million cubic meters. A lot of this old growth they've identified was going to be what we're harvesting in the midterm. So now they've taken that away. So now we've got this hole that's just gotten deeper. And it's a deeper hole, which means there's going to be mill closures, and we've already seen it start.
The thing that's still not clear to me, and I kind of know the industry well, that I need you to explain to me and the viewers, is that the old growth in the interior has nothing to do with size or species. It could be the normal average log. So why, my question is, do we have to preserve old growth in those particular circumstances?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of the answer.
Yeah.
But I agree with you.
If you don't, then who will be?
Well, and again, this is part of the picture that's been painted by the environmental group. Because when you see, and you'll recall just in the last couple of months, there was the people blockading the bridge in Vancouver.
Yeah.
It was the Stop Old Growth Logging.
Yeah.
The government in the intentions paper says we're going to manage old growth differently. We're actually going to preserve a bunch of it while we figure that out. We're taking steps in the right direction. This group wants to just have a blanket ban on old growth logging. Well, what they're saying, without really understanding it, is that they want to stop logging on all trees that are over about 120 years old in the interior and 250 years old on the coast. Well, in the interior, that's 75 or 80% of all logging. So what they're really saying is, let's stop all logging in the interior and half the logging on the coast.
Sawmilling.
And half the sawmilling and half the pulp milling and half the value added.
Because it all follows each other.
You will not have your raw material when the sawmills close and this pulp mill is going to go away.
You will not have value-added manufacturing unless you have a healthy primary.
And it's because the public believe that those big trees grow everywhere. Because they don't know.
Respectfully, I don't blame them, because that's what they see.
It's the narrative they've been sold.
Yeah. And I think, respectfully, industry has not done a good job in showing that. And part of that is, hey guys, friends of the primaries and the other ones, I'm going to say it, is that primaries in a lot of ways, because of the past and hopefully not so much the present and the future, they have not been forthright in their arguments. Yeah. And I see that as we are arguing. I'm not going to over-belabor value-added again as it relates to why it is so important, is that I see that in value-added manufacturing because that's where it is going to go and you can't stop it. Yeah. And by fighting against it, you're losing credibility. And the same applies to, I believe, the old growth, because it's not in the public's interest.
Yeah. And I don't like saying we haven't told a good story, but we haven't told a good story.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's difficult to fight back in the media, who like the hype of it. You know, there's nothing better on the news at 6 o'clock than 500 people rallying to save the last old growth forest at Fairy Creek. None of them knew that 80% of that drainage was already in a permanent protected area, and that teal was logging up on the very edge 20 hectares. That wasn't, you know, part of the mainstream story. And it's hard to push back on.
But the other problem with it, Jim, in a lot of ways, is that people like yourself, you know, you are an expert in the field. You have been through all of it. You've seen it all. People like Russ Taylor, you know, is another expert. Rob Schutz, and there are experts. I consider myself one in the field that have strong ideas about it, but mainly on the basis of they believe in British Columbia and they believe in what we have here and what we can do, and not so much that it's self-serving, but also if it is good for the province, it's good for us and the people that follow us, our kids, grandchildren. And
I think we're absolutely in agreement there. There's a good future for this industry, and it's because, as you said earlier, we can't help but grow good trees, right?
Yeah.
You look around, there's lots of cut blocks, but we've been doing this for 100 years here.
Yeah.
The trees grow well. The sawmills are the best in the world. The cost structure we could fix, right? There's a strong future for the industry, but we have to get by the rhetoric, and the rhetoric in the media specifically, which is basically educating the lower mainland urban population that there's a crisis. And as I said before, there's no crisis.
Yeah. And what I've said is I go anywhere, I speak at any particular location. A lot of times industry is afraid of people like me, you know, speaking up about the industry as to what it can be. And I had an opportunity to make a presentation last Friday at BCTS, and I've always find it amazing, and there were a lot of questions you know, from the people, the students there in regards to the industry. A lot of people believe in the industry. A lot of people like the industry, but but it lacks a lot of times is that in-depth information, like what we are talking about in terms of the deferral system, the old growth, the future of the industry.
It just takes time.
Takes time, but it also takes people like yourself, myself, Russ Taylor, and those people that are being recognized as credible and having that information. Kofi is one, but needs to work on that particular area as well, getting the information out. That's where the future is, and there is so much potential.
And I think the public's receptive, as I was talking earlier about polling that's been done recently by the Truck Loggers Association. 80% of the people in this province like the forest industry. They're not opposed to it. They just want to know it's being done properly. And then you've got the radical 20% that have been, you know, drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, from, you know, misinformation that's fundamentally being put out by environmental groups, and we're fighting against it all the time.
Yeah, and which is likely the way it will, no matter when, and it just means that you know, the ones that have the different views, like we do here, have to be more vocal about it. And I find a lot of times the industry is its own worst enemy because it is afraid to talk about delicate issues.
Here's my last comment on the old growth.
Yeah.
Do you know why there's every year? I've been 45 years in this business, and every year or two there's another last forest that has to be saved. Do you know why that happens? Yeah. It's because there's so much of it in the province. Yeah. There's so much forest, there's so much old growth that once this is protected, there's always another one you can go and find. Yeah. And that's what the public misses. Yeah. And the times that you see it, you know, like you fly a lot, I fly a lot, and have for the last 25 years. When I fly, I always sit in the window. Yeah. You know, because I look looking
out,
at it.
and I look at it and I said, it's paradise. Yeah. It simply does not get any better than it is here. And, you know, and I love the industry. So, you know, so kind of looking forward, you know, the other part in closing likely is saying, you know, that we can do much more. First Nations will have much more of the timber available. They will have a lot more of the funding, because that is another part of it, sharing of the funding. The thing that where I think we are as a government I was quite involved in adding the Trades and Technology Center at the College of New Caledonia. My name is on it. When I made that presentation, I said that it will not be access to fiber or resources here. It will not be location of market. It will not be transportation. It will not be entrepreneurship. It will finding the skill sets to work in those factories that will stop investment. We have to spend more money on the skill sets that we need and go far beyond what we did at the college. And UNBC are great, but I said what we have to do is invest in the center of technology, the center of excellence, no different, not quite the size, but what they have at BCIT. We need that in Northern Biscaya.
And you put that in place, and what's everybody's issue today, no matter what industry you're in, is finding people and qualified people, right?
Exactly.
And I think you saw that and said, let's start making them up here, and then maybe they'll be available to work up here when we get through the intentions paper. First Nations are more involved, providing input to forest management. They hopefully sort out how the secondary manufacturing arrangement should work, and so that it grows. Yeah. And hopefully we can shut down the constant onslaught of the misinformation from the environmentalists, and we'll have a good industry. Just look at all the trees we've got.
It's amazing. Amazing. So just in we can talk for hours, and I want to have you come back to me here as well, and on our podcast, again talking about the industry. But as you look forward, I think the other part that I deeply believe, and I talked to Rob Schutz about it, and I just wanted to run it by you as well because you likely agree with that, is that, as you just pointed out, you fly over this area, you've got trees all over. This is absolutely a perfect country to grow fiber. That it wouldn't take us all that much to, and I refer a lot of times to one of the documents that I have here. I look at Sweden. Sweden produces on a per hectare basis, nearly double the amount of fiber on a per hectare than we do. With not too much effort, we can do the same here looking forward by investing more in the land base, and now struggling with what we say we only have 35 to 40 million cubic meters in the midterm, that if we start investing now, then the volume of timber available could be double or triple from what we have today.
And I don't disagree. Sweden has a model where they intensively manage forests, and they outperform us. But it's a private model, right? That's the fundamental difference. We've got a crown publicly owned forest where the government tends to do everything on every hectare. Right. And it really takes away from that focus on trying to get the most out of the forest. Right. The tenure system that we've already talked about at length doesn't help with that system, right? And so, because today, if a company was to make investments in a forest, they're not sure if they're going to recover them in the future, whereas in a private model, you can assure that. And I'm not advocating a private model. I'm just saying that it is possible to do it. We just have to figure out how to do it given the land base that we work with. You see, we have a bit of an example here, like Dunkley, the Novak brothers, in their mill, they had a license, that was 160,000. The tree farm license. Tree farm license. Yep. And over the years, by managing it well, they virtually doubled it in size. I remember when that tree farm license was first created, the allowable cut was around 85,000, right? And now they're at 200 and something. They have done so much better. So it is possible. It's a different model than a lot of the other places in the province because it's a tree farm, but it is the example of what you can do if you focus on the management of the forest. And do we then say that we should move to a model? I don't think it will ever become public, but going from rather than a volume-based tenure to an area-based tenure or a mixture thereof, where the ones that are involved by investing more proactively in that forest have then reasonable expectations of more access to fiber. That makes sense. And if you and me were there,
would you and me not agree that if we both were involved in company Acme Forest Products in saying that, hey Jim, here we are at the low point, and now we're looking at the midterm. Let's stimulate government to more invest, and other stakeholders more invest in the forest, because we will not only go from 30 to 60 where it used to be, we can go to 90.
Yeah.
But that's the longer term investment. Would that not make sense?
It makes sense, and I'm aware in my career of successive governments that have tried to go there, because I think they understand that too. If you have reasonable certainty of return on your investment, which any business in any industry must have, you're not going to invest money if there's no expectation of getting it back. But unfortunately, the public, prompted by the environmental community, tends to see those area-based tenures like Dunkley's, where they have the chance to invest and recoup. They see that as privatization, which is nothing like privatization at all. So they've tried it. I think government understands it, but it's how you attract investment in my mind. So I don't see it as a bad thing.
No. So in closing at least this part of our discussion, looking forward, the future looks good in the forest industry in British Columbia?
We're just in a bumpy patch, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But the future, we've got the best mills left. The forest is the forest, it just keeps growing. Government's got to sort out this balance, but I think if they can, and we all support government trying to get it right? Because we have the vested interest in it. There's still a good industry in this province, despite the fires, despite the beetle, despite the environmental pressures that we have to deal with. There's lots of wood, and it creates good jobs and good products.
And we're living in the best place in Canada, in the world.
And we can do more with it, to where you want to go. So.
Yeah. I want you to, you gave me this book, and I just want to show it to our public. If I Had Only Known is the title of the book, and Jim wrote it. I read it with interest. You had an amazing career, especially in the field, and your experience here in Prince George when you got hired by IFS and ended up in Williston Lake and all over. The other thing that I found interesting about the book is you encountered black bears and you encountered grizzlies.
Everything.
You were in the bush in the winter when it was cold. You were cold and wet, and then in the summer when you were warm and
wet. Wet all the time.
All the time.
If you work in the woods as a forester, you're always wet. And the book really, is a collection of stories about in the 80s when I was actively in the woods. And it's when we were developing this forest, right? Everybody recognized, look at all this wood out there, let's keep developing it. And it's just the stuff we had to do to build roads and, put in boundaries and do inventory work. And, it was just, I thought, it's a good way for people to understand. This is the reality of how the industry operated. Yeah,
and then the interesting part about it, we talked about it earlier, is that saying that, in the 50s and 60s, or in the 40s and 50s, when I was born in 1940, so in my lifetime, I'm 82 now, the industry has gone from being in the bush, in the small little mills, and it has gone through all of that, and all the transitions that happen. And you said it earlier, saying that they say the industry is in transition. Well, it's always been in transition.
Absolutely.
And still it has further to go. But the future, there's still a good career opportunity. And
I believe so.
And the industry looks good. It will become, innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. I believe that.
And First Nations support for how the forest is managed, get to the balance.
Exactly.
And we have a business model.
For all of us.
For all of us, exactly.
Jim, can I get you to...
Absolutely, I'll do that.
Do you sell this is it in...
Well, it's available through Friesen Press. If anybody's interested.
I just want to make sure that you...
The Friesen Press bookstore, and and I donate partial proceeds of every sale of every book to the Truck Loggers Association Forest Education Fund. So, and that'll happen at their convention in January. So
in this January?
That's when I'll make the first installment payment, so to speak, if people keep buying the
I
book.
hope they have interesting speakers there and don't miss somebody from the value-added sector.
All right, John, I appreciate this. There you go.
Thanks, Em. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And again, I'm showing you this book for the people, that extremely interesting book. And then I'm going to also give you a copy of my book, ADHD Unlocked.
Look at us, a couple of old forest industry types become authors.
You see, the other part that I'm doing right now, I'm writing a book and it's coming out in July. Friesen also, does my printing. So we already have printing room available. It is Finding Your Passion, Living the Dream, likely will be the title. And it talks about precisely the things that you have done, I have done, is that at some point in life we turned around and say, we're going to go in the other direction. And you did that a number of times successfully, and you're still doing it for all intents and purposes today.
I got out of the bush and put on a suit and went to work in a bank. That's changing direction.
but in the process, you're being recognized as one of the most knowledgeable experts in the forest industry in British Columbia.
I don't know if I'm
I'm
not the most knowledgeable. I just don't know the other
I
one.
give you that. I give you that credit, and I believe, and so are we both, and so are other people in the field.
Oh, I appreciate that.
So I'm going to sign this one for you, and then you have the other one already. Did I sign the other one?
Yep, I did. Yeah.
Did I sign it?
Yep.
Okay. And I'll get you a copy of the other one too. So,
there. Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody will read the books and then understand where we're coming from.
Well, we will keep reminding them, and we will keep speaking up whenever the opportunity presents itself.
The industry needs advocates if they want to, get their perspective incorporated into where the industry is going to be. So.
And then if you have some names that you think that should in particular be on our podcast, BC's forestry industry in transition, we want them to, and they don't all have to agree, and we are doing one a week, and sometimes more than one a week, and and at some point I'd like to bring you back as well.
Yeah, good. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate
John.
it.
Thanks.
Thank you.